So welcome, Nate, to the Creep Stop. This project started really with OAEC and MOA doing that review like before I was here, 2013, 2014, looking at what are the biggest problems for organic producers and perennial weeds. Perennial rhizomatous weeds were really the big thing, and it started with Pat Carr, Perry Miller, some other people getting the project going. And then it first started in 2018. I should have had my numbers straighter in my head, but 2019 was our first year here, and it's a 4-year rotation. So the different fields, we had different mixes of forage crops, cover crops. We had hemp in here at one point. We had a number of different crops, and this is the final wheat check year. And the orange markers kind of denote our different plots where we had small plots. This was a nice corner of alfalfa that was here. And we had alfalfa in the corner because it was easier to graze and hay when you didn't have to mix it in there.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the biggest take-home messages, I think, from the whole study is perennial forage crops put into a rotation for a number of years was really the best way to suppress Canada thistle in this context. You can do it with heavy tillage, but obviously that's not great for your soil health.
Right. Or your pocketbook.
Or your pocketbook, and your soil may blow away. Yeah. And so really that's, when you get into the annual crops, it's a little nuanced. Peas probably had more increase in thistle than wheat did. Wheat was a better competitor than peas, which lentils definitely were not great competitors with Canada thistle. So that was, those we saw the biggest population increases. We had trouble with some of the forage grasses. So we had good winter triticale, Austrian winter pea mixes, but every time we tried to follow it up with a millet later in the year, it was too droughted, it was too hot. And then you had plowed something under, then the thistle came back and kind of took off. So that's where we lost control when we did the plots. Yeah.
And so with the alfalfa here, was that terminated with grazing, or how did you harvest it, and then how did you get rid of it?
Yeah, so we had, and actually in the design we had 2 types of plots. We had one set that was standard tillage, and so there we just came through and we cut it off with a standard swather and baled it up and took it away. In the reduced till plots, we brought in sheep instead to graze those plots. They definitely ate all the biomass, and they did not like thistle, which might be maybe not too surprising. I can remember we were down here in these plots, we had some triticale on one side, or the whole plot, and then there was a big patch of thistle on the other side, and the sheep chewed the triticale down to the ground, and they ate a few flower heads off the thistle, and then they were like, okay, new pasture. And so it was harder to incorporate that into into it. Grazing was also a little bit hard with timing sometimes, getting the timing right. I don't know if you ever have to deal with that or encounter it. You have to be in 3 places at one time, and it doesn't always work out as smoothly. So this is spring wheat. In general, I think it's a great year for spring wheat. Looks good. This is one of actually probably the plots with the least amount of thistle in it, so we should go look at a plot with a lot of thistle in it. So
here, where we do see the thistle, what was the action here? Was this grazed as part of the grazing alfalfa trial?
This one, this one probably the cover crop. I don't know the exact identity of this without sort of counting, but I would guess cover crops really didn't fare that well against thistle in some ways. We didn't get them started. And then pea years also led to relatively growth in thistle. And often what happens is this is the end of the plot right here, and it goes back to that orange flag. And you can see that it probably, actually, we'll come back and cut this out later, but when you see it probably moved in from the edge, and really that's how it took this. It starts to creep and move in, hence the creep stop. And so Dan measured it out at the post farm on Huffine, and Canada thistle went about 5 feet of rhizome in 1 year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oof.
So the movement horizontally is really probably pretty large.
Mm-hmm.
Also, yep. And then cutting up these little pieces of rhizome. So if you dig down here, we actually might come back with an excavator and do this later. But if you dig down, we've done some thistle archaeology. And what you find is, our disc cultivators go down about that deep, right? If we're lucky. And the horizontal roots of the thistle are probably still below that.
Wow.
So they're a foot below the surface, basically.
Yep.
And then they start to spread horizontally. So even sometimes when we're disking, it may be more like underground mowing rather than really disrupting that big root mass that's below the surface.
So with the alfalfa, did you see it as the action of mowing everything, including the thistles, being one of the primary suppressants, or the actual competition from the alfalfa?
That's an awesome question. I think it's the actual, so we had some stands of alfalfa that were good to goodish. And I think it's actually, if you ever dig down, you ever have hand dug alfalfa, old alfalfa before, it's a horrible job because the roots are like this deep and the crowns are like that, right? And so I think the thistle and the alfalfa root is actually getting to where you have thistle competition. You have competition with the thistle. Because if we think of wheat, we can bend down and we don't, that's our root system there. So it's not really getting down and affecting that competition. I think the mowing helps, and the mowing at bolting helps a lot, but I really think the majority of the from the alfalfa comes from better root competition at low. And so I think it would be great to see what the sandfoin rooting depth and like what some of these things look like too. Because I really think it's getting into that root competition zone with thistle that really does it better. Yeah.
Nate.
Yeah, and so, what else of the annual crops, wheat actually is not a horribly bad competitor. If you kind of even like walk in here and look granted there's a lot of thistle in here, but right, there is a little bit of, the
still
wheat here,
growing.
There's still wheat growing, and wheat definitely does better than the pulse crops do, the annual pulse crops in those situations. So how do you manage your thistle? What's your strategy? Alfalfa.
Yep, that if you figured if you get 2 cuts on it, usually you've knocked it back significantly, but you're going to make your alfalfa last longer than that. And so, really, it seems like if we're able to get the alfalfa in and create a stable market for alfalfa, you could really have organic, the pressure of thistle in Montana, small grains almost disappear. It's just that I found with more tillage, if you ever till thistle, you're always losing. Especially disking, and it just gets thicker and thicker. And that's exactly what happened right here. That is exactly what it is. So amazingly robust, the thistle, and it was the disking that really encouraged it in some ways. So I think almost if you have thistle, you should not have a disc. And and then really looking at primarily having a sort of forage first rotation, so that you're not reluctantly growing forage, but you're able to actually get some good stands, aggressively planted alfalfa stands, and then hay it off and get rid of that thistle, mine it right out.
It's an amazing pollinator plant. When you stand in these patches, sometimes the thistle pollinators are pretty,
Absolutely.
There's something to it. But this one was one that has just been filled with much more thistle that was even in the last. This is one of Dan's same splits again. And you can almost see the line of the plot down the middle. You can see on the other end, the thistle's actually much shorter where we haven't tilled it for a few years. And then where we just disc it, we just made it horribly worse.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're gonna come back in here with the same sand foin and put it in here and see how long it takes to really reduce the stand. I think we're gonna split it. We're gonna have half go straight into sand foin and half stay disked longer, and then go into a hay barley for a season or two, or a triticale, and see if that makes a difference in how far you can reduce it or how quickly you can reduce it.
In pulling off those annual, winter annual forages like the triticale LP mix, were you getting enough tonnage when you swathed them off to basically justify being a crop itself, as opposed to having to rush in and put in a summer annual?
Yeah, no, we got decent tonnage to use as a forage. Yeah, no, I think it was actually pretty good. And I think because of this field location, it was a little bit foolhardy for us to think we were going to get a C4 grass to grow out here. It just, let's talk to the forage producers of the state. In the Paradise Valley, no one's growing C4 grasses. You have to get out towards Yellowstone, Mondack, that direction to get into the warm season grasses. And so, yeah, that was a little bit of our mistake in that. But I think we did get good when you got good winter triticale establishment. It works fairly well, and you cut it off, now or slightly earlier when the thistle is starting to bolt in those situations.
Yeah. Yep. Do you think if you had a primarily forage, but annual forage, so say 2 years of triticale peas or just triticale, that you would experience a similar reduction?
No.
Okay.
No, we didn't see that in the data. We didn't see the same, like if you used an annual forage, and we had a couple situations where we had some back-to-back annual forages, even cool season annual forages, you didn't see the same reduction as putting it into 2 years of perennial alfalfa. The first year we nursed it in with light hay barley seeding and then alfalfa, and then we had 2 full years of alfalfa, and it was not as good as having a wheat and then even multiple years of annual forages. I think the competition, when we think of how do we best compete with thistle, we have to have another perennial growth habit there doing the work. If you look across the state of Montana, we're a perennial state, right? We don't have a lot of annual grasslands. We don't have annual this or annual that. We sit here and we endure drought for long periods of time. We have a couple good years, and then we sit and endure drought again. And you have to really have that perennial life form in that context to be able to do that and suppress the weeds, I think, in that way. Yep, and the result, and this is the same things happened at Central Ag and Moccasin. Alfalfa was really good, and tilled fallow, you could obviously keep things clean with tilled fallow. And then everything in the middle was a bit more muddled, but a lot of you got growth in thistle populations. Corvallis, we did it with field bindweed in Corvallis, Montana at Western Ag with Zach Miller. Same result there for field bindweed. The alfalfa and the tillage did great. The annual cropping mixes in the middle just were more variable. The cereals were definitely more competitive, but they didn't hold things in check as well as you would have liked them to.
And what was your seeding rate on the alfalfa that you felt did the best job?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know what the seeding rate is off the top of my head. We should ask Perry Miller that.
Okay.
And we'll ask Perry that, but we did nurse it. I think we had 40 pounds. I sowed the barley, and I remember it was like 40 pounds per acre, so like a half rate of barley. So we're talking about Puccinia punctiformis thistle rust. And here's an infected stem, Dan Chichinski doing some awesome work over there on it. And he's been comparing how this fungus affects the thistle, and it does reduce below ground biomass 8 grams, and that's in a pot that's in a greenhouse that's like a hanging basket pot. So that's a considerable reduction in biomass actually. And then Dan's been doing some research, how do you implement it in the field? So that's why we were kind of looking at what happens when you have the split of disking versus mowing. And we've had this just in kind of we'll call it an annual forage, because we mostly just have to mow it down because of the thistle. but we don't see a lot of reduction. But I mean, if you could take this and then combine it with alfalfa and like hit your patches there, that might actually be a fairly decent way to impact thistle over time.
Can you propagate this and like, put in a solution then to apply it if you were to spray it on?
Potentially.
Okay.
The hard part is actually producing the pathogen. So we have to collect it off of Canada thistle that's infected, remove the infected leaves so that we have the spores, and then spread it from there.
Got it. Okay.
Well, we can't actually produce it.
Yeah.
And it actually has 6 spore stages, or like 6 life. So when you see it in this, these are the aciospores in Uridia. And then we actually have to wait to collect it and get teleospores off it in like another month or something like that. It goes through a whole nother stage of spore production. And so then we have to come back to it. And then in the fall, what we've done to spread it is we go to the rhizomes in the fall and we put like 1 gram of like a teaspoon of the powdery mass on there. We have one strain, the Norgard strain is actually a really nice strain from Ole's.
Okay.
He has some of it in some of his patches, and it works pretty well. Yeah, it works. I mean, we don't see. I think it's one of those things you'd have to combine and really figure out how to commercialize and do. But it's an interesting. It has potential. Yeah. And is that one that that's one that died, huh?
So this is early dead. It's at the teleospore stage, so this is what we look for.
Yep.
When we're collecting spores, we'll just take these leaves and we'll reintroduce them where we want them.
Yep.
Cool. So this is an example of, you said, minimal disturbance, just mowing?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and like look how much weaker I mean, yes, the weeds are horrible and there's no crop.
Sure.
But if you look at the thistle
But even just
performance,
the stem diameter is so much reduced in this part of the field.
So if you could figure out how to, maybe that's part of the perennial too, is the non-disturbance. The thistle just doesn't like it if you don't disc it a little bit.
Yeah.
It doesn't get stimulated. So if you could encourage the thistle rust, prevent soil disturbance for a few years and have a perennial forage come out of it, I think it would be, And I do like your idea too of like, what would you do if you chopped it up? Like horses will eat the heads off the flowers all the time.
Right, yeah. And so even like this, if you were to chop this and then put it into a TMR and feed it out at a reduced rate, it seems like it could get past.
Yeah, so we've literally tried everything, and so we were looking at eating it actually, and so we came out in the spring as the rosettes were emerging above the surface, and we cut them down like asparagus, and we took the shoot that was very crispy. You can kind of eat it. It tastes like, it's actually not too bad. It's like it's a little bit like watercress or like a water chestnut or something, kind of nibble to it, and we ate it. We made some soup out of it. We tried a few other things, but that was actually one of our ideas. It was like, could you take this and use it as a forage somehow with, not having seed or that kind of issues like that, like silage chopping it or like pelletizing it or something.
Totally, yeah.
Figure out how to do something with it in that way.
And so looking at the success of the wheat with the alfalfa, is there any reason to try anything else? I mean, if it's just an economic question of how do we make alfalfa more valuable, and something that works in the entire rotation, and then just grow it on half the acres in the state. Any reason that you don't think we should be running towards that at this point?
No, I think if I were an organic producer, that I'd be running toward. I would be like, okay, how do I have a good section of perennial alfalfa forage in there? Being an experimenting person, I'd be like, I wonder what sandflint would do.
Totally.
But if I want my insurance policy, and that's what I think kind of came out of the study a little bit. If you want to be steady and resilient, you establish that stand of alfalfa, and even in these drought years that we just saw go through, there was still alfalfa growing on the surface. and it was still there, and it still grew, and it suppressed the weeds. And when we had crop failures and other things like peas or this or that because of drought, alfalfa was still steady on.
That's great.
And existed there. So to me, yep, I think it should be part of the rotation.
Cool.
Those rotations.
Good to hear.
Yep.
I think it informs the question of, how do we eat our way out of these weed problems?
Yep.
And instead of thinking how do we come up with a lot of new uses for sort of minor crops, it seems like just eating a cow.
Yep.
Sounds like a really good idea if we're going to be utilizing that alfalfa somewhere.
Yep, exactly. When people ask about sustainability, you're like, yeah, annual cropping can be pretty hard.
Yeah.
And so having perennial forages that are then fed into a cow, yes, a cow may only be 10%, 20% efficient,
right.
but it's still, you're getting value out of the weed suppression, those forage, all that stuff out of there. So yeah, it's definitely a mix of both when you think about sustainability and how we eat and
For sure.
how we live. Yep.
And no tillage.
Yep, and reducing that tillage.
Tillage is so expensive.
It costs a lot for diesel.
Yeah,
and you see, like, really, Dan, it's just unreal how much bigger the thistle is there than it is here.
Right.
And what you were saying last year in the end, this ended up catching up to that.
Yeah, we didn't end up
Thistle-wise?
Yeah.
Okay.
We took biomass samples and didn't have any differences.
So there must be a little window of time in here where you're like, okay, it's small. Because all the literature says you want to cut it when it's bolting right now because it's decided it's going to make flowers, it's putting energy up here, right? And will weaken those roots below if we cut it now.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting to see how it ends up breaking out in the end, but yeah, maybe it catches up because this conserves soil moisture a little bit, and that warms. One thing we do notice is as soon as you put the disc and turn something black, the soil temperature just goes up so much more.
Yeah.
And so it might be a little bit, it got stimulated by it having warmer temperature in the beginning of the season. But I don't know. And I think the disking stimulates it too. Yeah.
And so you were saying that with sort of blackened summer fallow that you did see thistle control?
Yes, but it has to be above a certain frequency. And so out at the Western Ag Research Center for field bindweed, it was every 3 weeks.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
So it works at every 3 weeks.
Sure. So really we should take the diesel expense of that sort of rate, compare it against the revenue loss of alfalfa.
So, that's a good economic way to think about it,
Cool.
because you're going to be putting that effort into it. Because if you do it too little, you're just spreading those chunks of rhizome. So you have to just continually come back, which that's what the old literature says. Like when you look in the old bindweed literature from the 40s, how do we manage it before, people had herbicides or thought about that kind of stuff. The 40s and the 50s, it was every 3 weeks cultivation.
Yeah.
And so that was what people were probably doing in parts of Montana too. Wow.
Yeah. Better be a wet year.
Yeah. So
that's a lot of action. Yeah.
That's a lot of action. It's a lot of diesel fuel. And so, but maybe in the future, we might think about precision too. You're like, oh, I got a little patch that popped up in my field. Maybe you have a section of a field that's 10 feet by 10 feet, and maybe you do cultivate that section every 3 weeks or something like that, and keep that one in check, and then work around that in a sort of precise mapping way. I could see that being a strategy too. Of coming in and if you had a field, being good about monitoring it and then coming back in and doing small applied management to it. Or plant those certain sections out into alfalfa too and kind of come around those and switch some sections up.
Yeah.
I guess you think about how the crab trees do it. They have a lot of the strips up in their country and like small strips. Yeah.
And then at what point do you pass the economic threshold of organic matter and it becomes better off to spray herbicide? Spray it out, take that 3-year hit.
If you're going to be tilling that much, right? Yeah.
And at what point is that more beneficial?
Yep.
The problem with herbicides and thistle is no single herbicide treatment works.
Can you say that a little louder for the people in the back?
No single herbicide treatment of Canada thistle will work. You will end up spending a couple of years doing that. And so maybe, and then you're like, well, alfalfa. So you come back, we end up back at the same, the alfalfa spot again.
Yes.
Yep. Yes. So yeah, you know, I mean, thistle management with herbicides, it's multiple applications of high rates of herbicides. It's not a, yeah. Harry was saying he's got patches, he spot sprays for 20 years and he's like, they still come back.
Yeah, right.
So